Okay, good morning, Billy. This is the follow-up, as you know, to the webinar we did back in October, I think it is. And these are just picking up on some of the questions for the WMG construction group webinar. So I'll fire straight away. First of all, good morning, Billy.
Morning.
And we'll fire straight away into some of the questions we didn't get to answer. And the first one is, how could the waste minimisation be incorporated at the design stage?
Well, I did touch on that in the presentation. I'll just remind you, David, that on slide 7, there was 3 sort of waste tools. And one of them, the last one in the far right, was a tool which was part of a guide developed between RAP and the RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects. And there is a web link on slide 7 to that tool and that guide.
In relation to new build, I've heard should allow 1 skip per house. Does that sound feasible?
Well, I've not heard of any official industry standard to that nature, but I do know that some projects will set goals for how many skips per site or per project. So it's entirely up to the project team. And of course, it would be dependent on the type of project, you know, a refurbishment compared to a new build, and the size and the scope will play a big part in that.
And that goes on to actually the language used, because very often we use words like number of units when you're building a multi-floor, multi-story development with kitchens and bathrooms bought in or built in or modular. So it's a kind of, at what point do you include waste? Is it the whole supply chain or just on the construction site? Do I suggest there's some more research needed in that area?
Yeah. I mean, it is part of where I want to go next with the research.
An interesting a question about what improves the segregation of waste at source based on your research.
I don't know. The research has basically done 2 things. It's looked at the root cause of the waste, the reason why the waste has arisen, and we've put a cost on the waste. So the next stage for us is to find an industry partner, which we're in the process of doing at the moment, who can take us to the next level, which is going to be mapping the sources of the waste to the best solutions for that source. So if the source is, client or design changes, or if the source of the waste is poor industry practices in terms of procurement or management on site, then we want to do a mapping exercise to that. So we've not got there yet, and that's the next stage of the research.
A question, I think it's a generic question. Is there any data for waste sent for incineration? If so, is there data on energy generated? Well, for general waste that produced by local authorities and private commercial contractors, they'll go, when they go to energy from waste plants, yes, the Weybridge is the way it all in, and yet energy from waste plants do record the amount of energy they generate, because they have to put it into the national grid, and their costs and everything associated to it. So outside of that, I'm suggesting that the data will be hidden there, albeit it may not be explicit and available yet in the public domain. Would you go with that, Billy?
Yeah. I mean, some of my colleagues at Glasgow Caledonian University work in that specific area of energy from waste, and they would probably know better than me, but I could follow up with that, but it's difficult to get that information if it's not in the public domain.
And my comments are based on a walk around a local energy from waste plant where I live here, a brand new one by, I think it's Foxer and Buckinghamshire Council. So it was quite interesting. Everything's recorded coming in and going out. So, but how that is related back to the suppliers and providers, that I don't know. Okay, the next question is, do you think the Scottish waste regs have helped us enforcing waste to be presented for disposal by waste stream? Has it helped reduce waste rather being ignored on construction sites? Is everything in a mixed waste skip rather than a co-mingled waste skip? I'm not sure about how that question, how well it reads, because I'm going to ask the question slightly differently. We have all the waste is co-mingled, or do we have separate skips for separate things?
You probably know the answer to that before I answer it, David.
I didn't like the question.
It depends. A couple of answers there. It depends on the available space Depends if the contractor is using an intermediary that can deal with segregation off site. And it depends on how conscientious the contractor is, doesn't it, at the end of the day? Because there's never enough enforcement of regulations, no matter which regulations they are. So therefore, the more conscientious contractors will participate more in waste segregation and recycling, whereas those who are less conscientious will just opt for mixed skips. And in general, there are exceptions to the rule, but in general, the larger the contractor, the more they realise the potential benefits and reputational damage of not recycling and segregation, whereas the smaller the contractor in general, the less likely they are to participate in that.
Are you aware of any recycling options? I'm rewording the question that's been sent, because the question I kind of don't think it can be answered very easily. So I'm rephrasing it. So can the following be recycled, as it were, or is there a use you're aware of, like wooden cable drums when suppliers don't want them back, plastic ducting, empty mastic tubes, and other items that be overawed or wrongly specified? The last one, Billy, I think you just said that if they've been wrongly specified or wrongly provided, you take it back and have a contract dispute with the supplier, wouldn't you?
Well, when the wrongly specified, I believe, is a reference to those who are involved in specification for the project. So that's maybe the designer or the contractor with the design options as part of their contract, rather than the supplier themselves. Each of these examples I've been tentatively trying to draw from the suppliers that I know where they're at with this, and I've had one or two contractors approach me as well, but it seems to be quite a murky area to try and break into and get data on. Nonetheless, it does feature again as part of, if I just reiterate, the next phase of the work, which is the mapping reasons for. So lots of these will have good reasons why there's cable drums in the skip, and many of the examples relate to obviously packaging and materials used by the supplier, which are there to protect against damage and such like that end up in the skip. Which and I know I'm aware of packaging regulations which are sort of EU driven, so I don't know where that will go in the future. But we, I think all we can do at the moment is document where we see good practice, which will be what I'll be doing as part of the next stage of the research.
And that leads on to the question that, did you get any feedback, or did you see any feedback in respect to suppliers taking back packaging and pallets? Did you see any evidence during your study? Was that discussed at all?
With pallets being taken back, because that's been established for quite some time, so it's a well-established retrieval system. However, even that is under threat now because of safety concerns around damaged pallets making their way back into circulation. So it's a complex area, and that, I mean, if it had been easy to do, then it would be done by now, wouldn't it? And that's obviously one of the many reasons why it's a difficult and complex.
They're a great source for wood burners and things, but the nails are a bit sharp in there when you come to pull them apart. That is part of the problem.
I've been there as well. Yeah.
Do you know how, if builders build the cost of waste into initial cost for work, or does it come off the bottom line?
I mean, there is a
wonderful term, builders. That's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? Covering.
I would say that there is a notional 5% that a quantity surveyor will, custom and practice will include 5% for materials wastage. But as I say, that's custom and practice. That's a historical practice that I've seen from quantity surveyors when they're dealing with materials. But in more recent times, again, project teams will try to put specific goals on the amount of waste. But that's where the limitation is. They'll put a goal. They'll pluck a figure out their head, like we had from one of the previous questions, like one skip per site, for example, with no idea about why the waste is arising. And that was basically why I did the research that I did, was to try and find out the reasons why in real terms, so that we can then move to the next stage of reducing it. So, some quantity surveyors might say that they now reduce that 5% to zero, but that might be aspirational rather than a fixed figure that they can calculate and meet.
Yeah, Hannah asked the question: is there about can unused materials be donated to charities or building projects? And are there any proposals? Well,
There is. Sorry, on you go, David.
It either happens or it doesn't. There's no, if companies want to do it, there's no reason why they can't.
Yeah, yeah.
Appropriate.
I was going to say that there is one charity that I'd been asked to be involved in a specific proposal, and it was called, the charity is known as the Remade Institute, and I can send you a link to that to put into the video if you like, David. What they do is they recruit, so they employ people who are unemployed and give them a role in terms of the process of supplying and reusing or upcycling furniture and fixtures. And the proposal that we had was to link up with building projects specifically, and with clients who have properties that need to be renovated or demolished, and these properties might have existing fixtures and fittings that could be reused or upcycled as part of the circular economy. So I am aware of that Remade Institute, that it's called.
Jamal's asked a question. I'm just noting that with everything in environmental management and waste, that we tend to use taxation and penalties to balance, or to reweigh, to put balance to the cost benefit of the activity. Someone's asked the question: why highlighted the said issues about waste, and what outcomes at the construction sites to accompany high management? What comes as a priority? Would it be cost on the environmental effect of said waste? And I tend to think it'll be eventually the cost, won't it? Because we'll actually end up taxing it or whatever to make it an economic consideration, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean that's the whole rationale between the landfill tax and the aggregates levy, isn't it? Is because the government realizes that, particularly for the private sector, they have to make a profit. It's what drives them. So therefore, it's terribly difficult. It's what kind of pressure must you be in to forego profit and dip into the red because you've made a positive environmental impact? It stands to reason that you've got to pull every tax lever you have available, notwithstanding the current fiscal dilemmas we have at the moment, and the current pandemic and situations that we have.
A comment here, Nicola first of all says, thanks for a great presentation. Would be good to know whether the sites engage directly with the local waste skip provider, or whether they operated through a waste broker.
Well, I'd hinted at this when I said intermediaries. So that's one of the intermediaries that I was referring to, such as a waste broker. I know that again tends to be the bigger the contractor, the more likely they will be engaging the services of a waste broker, because that just, one, means that they can outsource the problem, and two, a lot of these will be very tight construction sites where there's no space to segregate on site, and a waste broker fulfills that opportunity. The contractors that I work with on the project, 1 out of the 3 engage the services of a waste broker, and it was it was actually the civil engineering project.
Okay. I'm trying to look at in terms of disposal and transport costs for the waste. Was that included in your study?
No, it didn't, because the focus was, with the study, we're trying to convince predominantly the contractor, and to some extent the client. So those costs we didn't believe were, maybe indirectly, but not as easy to tie back to the contractor. Part of that total cost figure is to try and motivate, to try and convince the contractor that it's hitting their bottom line. So we've focused predominantly or exclusively on costs that we thought the contractor could influence there. Therefore, any costs once it leaves the site and goes elsewhere, we believed that that was a bit less able to influence the contractor, that mattered to them.
Okay. Next one is particular construction company has advertised there will be zero carbon by 2030. Have you any background on how that can and will be achieved? That's a bit of a big
No,
question that's a bit of a big question, that.
no, but I mean that there's a contractor that we are taking forward as a result of this work, and that is to bring together the work that I've done with the work of the contractor and their client organization, and their ultimate goal also is zero carbon at some point. You know, they've not set an actual date, but it's part of that bigger picture. So it's not something that I can give you an answer to right now. There's maybe good practice documented in guidance, but for now, it's part of the next stage of the work.
That's another webinar in its own right, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the project that I'm referring to is a potential knowledge transfer partnership, which is a collaboration between academia and industry to solve, you know, the industry partners' problems that might lead to, you know, either economic or wider benefits. So that's a KTP, it's known as, and if any other listeners or viewers of the webinar are interested, then they can contact me in that respect.
Okay, this is a do you think? So a question is asked, do you think, is a yes or a no answer, which may actually oversimplify what we're asking. But anyway, do you think the company should justify to the Environment Agency or the appropriate regulatory body in Scotland the amount of waste each company discards and produce an improvement plan to reduce their waste?
Yes, of course, and I think in a roundabout way that's what the site waste management plan regulations tried to do on a project by project basis, and they ultimately, you know, were discontinued by the government and had a very short lifespan. But if we were to reintroduce something similar, I would say that you know, unlike the site waste management plan regs, I would like to see something a bit more sophisticated that demands that any action plan actually looks further up the supply chain and looks further up the waste hierarchy, rather than just, you know, focusing on the output, the waste itself, without considering, you know, how that waste has arisen.
Next question is, have you come across certification programs like LEED and TRUE?
No.
I haven't either.
That's a short answer. That's all I can say. But it would be a good thing to look at. I know that LEED in particular, I would be interested in creating a waste equivalent. Would be great. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the person who wrote that question can maybe look into it a bit, maybe do some research themselves at Mathan, and maybe come back to EWMG for another presentation. There you go. I like putting challenges out for you. Ask the question, then maybe you're the best one for the answer. I think we covered plasterboard on the day, didn't we? About plasterboard. Plasterboard is classed as difficult waste and should be segregated from other waste. We tackled that on the day, didn't we?
Yeah.
And here's one here, I think it's out of scope by Abdul Quadri. How do you manage the paper waste contaminated with ink and the photocopying machine wastes? That's out of scope for a construction project. I think I wouldn't want to take that question.
Yeah.
Another question, I think, again, could be out of scope about PPE waste and doing how much discarded PPE could be usable or in good condition. I think you got to go back to the basic regulations regarding PPE. If it's not designed for as multi-use, you don't use it multi-use. If it's designed to single use and could be cleaned and used, then you have to look at that. But specifically, PPE is personal to the person, used within the what it's designed for. I think I don't want to take it any further than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all part and parcel of the circular economy. If you can design PPE with reuse and recycling in mind, all well and good. But the question may have been prompted because, if you remember, David, one of the sites in the pilot study included 2 boxes of latex gloves, which were skipped because they were latex and deemed to be inappropriate. So they had to, because latex can be a sensitizer, or many people can be allergic to latex. Therefore, I think the site management team had ordered them in error and binned them in the skip in favour of they'd purchased a non-latex substitute. So I think that's what might have prompted that.
I think there was two questions on PPE about how much discarded PPE could be usable or in good conditions, and again that is very much in this country. Again, we go back to your previous question about people just chucking things away that they shouldn't be chucking away. But if stuff has been used, then basically it's a one life anyway, isn't it? In many cases. Interesting here from Kate again. From your experience, how is the best way to get buy-in from everyone on project? Everyone from client, designers, some contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, admin, and the best way to get the message to reuse, reduce, recycle across?
My experience, my personal experience with any initiatives within construction projects is that if the client isn't on board, it won't happen. For some reason, the construction supply chain is incapable of managing their client, and things only ever happen with the client support, and in many cases, with the client demanding it happens. So I only ever see things happen, changes happen on projects if you get to the client. So that's the first step, I think, is you get the client on board. So therefore, it needs to appeal to the client, whether that be financially, regulatory, or their moral instincts. You've got to find out what type of client you're dealing with and appeal to what motivates them. After that, then your engagement needs to go all the way right down to the guy on the tools. When I say the guy, the person on the tools. And I'm a big exponent of worker engagement and involving them in the decisions, involving them in the solutions so that they can take ownership of it, rather than telling them, dictating to them that this is the new plan, this is a new strategy that's been decided by some, as we say in this part of the world, some high Hegian, which translates to some senior manager.
Another question here about excess storage of materials on site will most likely end up in waste, either as a result of spoil, damage, or unuse. That's from Patrick. Just a comment on that thought?
Yes, it was on the slides, one of the early slides, looking at the possible causes why waste ends up in the skip, and in many cases, if you were to do a weighting as to how many times site damage or over ordering or storing inappropriately leads to materials in the skip, that accounts for quite a percentage of the waste. And what I would say is that it's not the only, but many people think it is the only reason why waste ends up in the skip, which was the reason why I wanted to do the research, was to bring to people's attention that that's not the only reason why waste ends up in the skip.
Okay, I think we kind of half covered this question as well. Who pays for the waste? So the contractor purchasing their own materials that are not built into the costing of the projects is at their expense. Therefore, they're using as much as possible up. If the client is paying the cost, then maybe they are less worried about throwing the waste away. Or just taken into consideration. You mentioned audit and checking, didn't you, in your presentation quite a bit as a key learning point?
It's the contractor that pays, but the client ultimately. But the contractor, and this is why I answered one of the earlier questions when I was asked which costs did we look at. So I specifically looked at costs that the contract would grab the attention of the contractor, because that's who I'm speaking to in the first instance. The contractor pays the cost of the labour to put waste in the skip. That's a labour cost. The contractor pays for purchasing materials that end up in the skip, so that's a contractor cost. And they can try and pass it on, and depending on the contract terms, they may or may not be able to. But I would imagine most times the contractor, if they get it wrong and they've got excess waste, it's hitting their bottom line. So that's who the research was predominantly aimed at.
I've got two questions about bricks in skips. Some observations, I think, more than more than strategy rather. I've seen builders dropping pallets of bricks into a skip. When I challenged it, they said the cost of handling, transport, administration and storage was more than saving of keeping them for future use. And Debbie says, I work in a recycling centre and the amount of new bricks and wood that come to some construction sites is unreal. Let's hope this event highlights to them that recycling is cost effective.
Yeah, I remember seeing a presentation by one of the local Glasgow waste contractors, which had a skip with 2 full pallets of brick in the skip. And the reasons just given there in the questions were the same reasons. It's easier to get rid of it than have to deal with it. And it flows from a procurement problem, which is it's better to have too much of the material than too little, because too little can result in far too many people standing about idle, which is a huge project cost. So there you have it. An obvious answer to that, or solution to that, is back to the supplier. In many areas where you buy materials or you call off materials from a supplier, if something is standing in a pallet unused, then I think there should be some requirement on the supplier to take that back. Why wouldn't they? They could resell that entire pallet of brick to someone
even
else.
to take it back at zero cost.
Yeah.
I think we're talking about it's A is the cost of one thing and B is the waste that affects all of us.
Yeah. I mean, another solution are these websites come and go, but it's the same idea as the Remade that I mentioned earlier, and that is, you know, intermediaries that will sell salvage as secondhand to the general public through a website, you know, like an eBay type approach. There's been lots of similar websites come and go over the years, but I don't think there's been one. As soon as someone can make that work in a more you know, flowing, easy to access way, then that's an option also as well.
Okay, and my last question or comment, because I think it's out of scope, that it is out of scope. Someone's asking about why manufacturers can't be forced to use glass bottles instead of plastic, which could be returned, because they don't have such a bad environmental impact. And the second question this person asked was, how can we recycle better if the manufacturer didn't change the approach to plastic packaging for years? The only way I can convert that into a construction related question is regarding some of the stretch wrap or shrink wrap used around pallets to keep goods in place. There is no plan B, is there? Are we stuck with that for technology?
I don't see why it can't be biodegradable. I think the technology is already there for biodegradable plastics. And I don't see why. I mean, I'm not an expert in that area, but I don't see why the government can't make it happen, because again, there must be cost implications here. So the government needs to decide what it wants to do and how serious it is about protecting the environment. They could make that mandatory a stroke if they wanted.
Billy, many thanks indeed for answering all the questions. That is all of them. Thank you very much indeed, Billy.
Thanks, Dave. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.